Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be going over more advanced tips for Canada, including area codes, license plates, landscape, and language. I'm going to make this a series, going over more detailed tips for every country. This should make you more accurate with your guesses. Right away, I'm going to start with how to identify Canada, and one of the best ways of doing this is with its stores. So you'll have stores like Save on Foods, Shoppers Drug Mart, A&W. We got Scotia Bank over there. We have a Canadian liquor store right there. There is a Canadian bank right there. These are stores that are, for the most part, exclusively found within Canada. Another thing to remember is that Canada uses the metric system, which means that you'll see kilometers, not miles. This is probably the easiest way to tell Canada apart from the USA. And finally, just the landscape. Canada's pretty diverse in its landscape, but you'll often see hills and mountains covered in trees on the east coast and the west coast. And in the interior of the country, it'll be very flat with some occasional ponds on the side of the road. Now I'm going to go over every individual province. I'll put the flag in the top left for you to see in case you encounter that. So right away we have British Columbia. British Columbia is pretty unique compared to the rest of Canada. It often has a lot of hills and mountains covered in forest. You won't really find anywhere else like this in Canada, except for maybe a couple parts in the Yukon or Newfoundland. The landscape is definitely the best way to help identify British Columbia. And more north of British Columbia, you're gonna have fall or autumn coverage, usually closer to the Yukon border. And here are some common area codes found within British Columbia. Moving east, we have Alberta. Alberta's pretty easy to tell apart. The best way is the license plates, which have a red tint to them. This is because Alberta license plates have red text on them. This is only found in Alberta, Canada. Nowhere else in, I think, North America really has license plates like this. Also, as we move east, you can tell that it's a lot more different than British Columbia, as it's a lot more flat. It'll mostly be the same in Saskatchewan and parts of Manitoba, and even parts of Ontario as well. And here are some common area codes found in Alberta. Next we have Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan has green license plates, but don't get these confused with Manitoban license plates. Saskatchewan license plates have green all over them, and that's important to remember. Also in Saskatchewan, it's not uncommon to be placed in just a random town or village in kind of the middle of nowhere with like 6 houses. This can also be in Manitoba, but it's definitely more common in Saskatchewan. So you'll find places like this, as well as these dirt roads are quite common in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Moving on to Manitoba, compared to Saskatchewan and Alberta, it has a lot more forests and trees, but it's still quite flat. Here we have some autumn or fall coverage, just like I showed you in BC. So you can also sometimes find this in Manitoba, but I wouldn't really look for this right away to determine where you are in Canada. The easiest way to tell that you are in Manitoba is the license plates. Now earlier I said that Saskatchewan had green license plates, so does Manitoba, but as you can see it's just green on the sides. Here's an unblurred one and it has black text. Saskatchewan has green text and the entire license plate will be green in the blur. Moving on to Ontario. Ontario is quite easy. You're going to have speed limit signs with a black bar at the bottom, and this is only found in Ontario, Canada. Nowhere else in North America or Europe will have this. But the most important part about Ontario for your guesses is this piece of land. Pretty much all Ontario coverage is here, because this is where like 50% of the Canadian population lives. And finally, in the capital city of Ottawa, which is located within Ontario, you're often going to have 2 languages on the signs. As you can see here, we have English and French. We have French there, and we have some French and English on this sign as well. This is very common in Ontario. You'll sometimes find it in New Brunswick as well. And here are some common area codes for Ontario. Next up, we have the easiest province in Canada. This is Quebec. Quebec has these stop signs which say arrêt on them, which is French for stop. These are only found in Quebec, nowhere else in the world. So if you find this on a stop sign, you are in Quebec. And we also have Canada Post here. Most coverage in Quebec is also found between Quebec City and Montreal. And here are some common area codes in Quebec. Moving on to the eastern provinces of Canada. This is definitely the hardest region to region guess in, but this is New Brunswick. Go here, we have French road signs, but most of the signs will be English. New Brunswick does have a very large French-speaking, so you'll also find bilingual signs as well, but it's definitely different from Quebec, as you can see just with the architecture and the landscape. And here are some common area codes in New Brunswick. Next we have Nova Scotia, and I'm also going to kind of include Prince Edward Island in this. They're both pretty uncommon. I find the best way is the front license plates, which most cars in these two provinces do not have. So if you find a lot of cars without front license plates and you know you're in Canada, it's definitely going to be in one of these two provinces. And here's some area codes in these two provinces. Finally, we have Newfoundland. When it comes to landscape, Newfoundland can quite often be confused with British Columbia, but I find the best way to tell apart is Newfoundland has a lot of these types of houses with this like paneling on the front, and we just have a Newfoundland flag here as well. And here are some area codes in Newfoundland. Finally, moving on to the territories, we have the Yukon, which is right above British Columbia, and the landscape does look pretty similar, but the best way to tell it apart from British Columbia is the license plates. The license plates from British Columbia have a blue tint to them because they have blue text. The ones in the Yukon have a blue bar on the bottom with white on the top. Next we have the Northwest Territories, which is pretty easy because it has such limited coverage. The landscape here is pretty unique. It's quite rocky, quite flat, and you'll have this tree line with Gen 2 coverage. The coverage in the Northwest Territories is quite limited as it's only this one highway. Finally we have Nunavut. In Nunavut, you're going to have stop signs like this language, and also English. It's also going to be very snowy. Could sometimes be confused with Greenland, but there's going to be a bit more English around. Also, coverage in Nunavut is very uncommon. I think there's only 3 places that have coverage, and there's this one weird place that has boat coverage. It's just right here in this region. Hopefully you learned something from today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, please subscribe. I'll leave this map in the description, and I'll see you in the next one.